Hey Internet, so we are now into week 3 of our first season of Wheels of the Neals, and still waiting to hear back from the City Council and the Firehouse, and nothing's really moved in that direction. On the personal front, I did get back my chapters for my dissertation from my dissertation advisor, so I've got my revisions, which this week, this coming up, starting today, I'm working through those revisions and so forth. So I already started making good progress on that. Thankfully, the in-laws took our daughter Ruth for the week, so I can get some extra work done on the dissertation and really make a push. Really hoping to defend by the end of the semester. So still putting out videos, some supplementals. I did the supplemental on the academic background, so if you're interested in what happened to me and my perceptions of that sequence of events, how I got into academia and the troubles that I underwent more recently, you can check out the supplemental video from last week. But again, on the actual show itself, I'm trying to remain progressive and forward-looking and trying to look to the future rather than dwell in the past. So that's trying to maintain that orientation for the show. So, this week, as we'll see in the projects, I am working with the 1990 Mercedes 300E. I've already got a lot of other projects that I've filmed that I just need to cut and edit and so forth, but I kind of slid this one to the front, and it's something that I've actually been doing the last, really the last couple weeks. I've gotten a few first videos about a week and a half ago, but anyway, the last couple days I've really been pushing on the 300 and trying to get it better sorted, and I'm doing that one for today because I really feel good about it. We bought this car for $600, really $500 plus $100 to deliver it. Sean and I went halvesies on it as a restoration car, and so far I've put very little money into it. I really spent the first money on it today. I put a battery in it, and the nice thing with a battery, if you end up junking the car or whatever, you can always get the battery back out. The battery is a universal investment. It can be used elsewhere if need be. We did put a battery in it, and I've been working through it. So in the sequence of videos that we're going to have in today's episode, it moves through just first impressions, getting into the car, going through the problems. When we received the car, we knew it was basically disabled. You couldn't drive it very far. You could just limp it a very short distance, and it would overheat and stall out. And I started getting into it, and I've been discovering some really goofy stuff. Sean said that I should probably have a segment like, the crazy things people do to their cars, what people do to their cars, something like that. That's just going to be a sub-theme of the whole show as I get into these cars and find the various things that people have been doing to them. So the process that we're tracking is, again, it has this stalling, rough idling, and so forth. Some initial guesses from the previous owner, O2 sensor and an exhaust issue, blocked catalytic converter or something like that. So I've been working through the system. Some things that I discovered. So we worked through we took off the throttled air, idle air control valve. Yeah, IACV, idle air control valve. That was the very first thing we did when we first started into it, and just soaked that. I did that before I started taking the video serious, so I begin by putting that back on and kind of talking through what we're doing, and greasing everything along the way. You can see disassembly of the air box. This is the 3-liter straight 6. It's just a classic engine kind of thing that just, this has 220 odd thousand miles on it, and the engine sounds great. Particularly once we've started breaking it open and getting these things going. So we worked through the idle air control valve, and just, working through the various systems. O2 sensor, we're going to disassemble the O2 sensor. Because of the wiring situation that I encountered, I did not actually remove it completely from the car. I left it plugged in and wired in, but I cleaned the connectors and cleaned the O2 sensor itself. Very, very gunked over, very carboned over. You have to get airflow into the sensor. It still might be dead, and I still might have to replace it, but I'm particularly, as the situation has been improving, I really think the O2 sensor is fine in it. Um, looking at the exhaust, and once I started running it, I put the new battery in it, clean out the battery compartment. You can see the drain and everything under there. Flushed the radiator, took off the radiator reservoir, which sits up by the battery, and you can see disassembly of that. Cleaned that all out, which was super gunky. And here's the really ridiculous thing that I encountered. This car basically had no coolant in it. It just had water in it. And that is a very bad idea. You're supposed to have 50-50 if you're using coolant concentrates. You can buy the pre-mixed, pre-diluted. I usually get the concentrate and then mix it myself just for cost sake. And if you're in northern climates and you need it colder, you go 60-40, even 70-30. But, you always have water in the mix, but you cannot run pure water. If you can limp a car a very short distance if you're leaking coolant and you just have water with you. You can put water in it and limp, but do not drive it like that. That's a good way to blow your engine. And so it's ridiculous that this had just water in it, and you can see the sludge build up. It's just awful. So I've already drained it and refilled it once. I plan to do that again as part of the process of bringing this thing back from the dead. This week it's just all about the 300 and how you can take something and just with cleaning and just working through the systems rapidly and vastly improve its run condition. So, and as a joke, I'm entitling the episode, "This is a Mercedes," because it's a 300. I love the movie 300, and this is Sparta, and he kicks him off. I got into this thing. I'm like, this only has water in it. Really? You did this to a Mercedes? You just put water in it. Somebody, a previous owner, who knows who it was, somebody put just water in this and was running it, and it, it clearly hadn't been cleaned out in a while. Awful, awful. Like, it just, the hairs in the back of my neck go up. Like, how could you do this to this car? Because I think with some cleaning and just, working on it, cleaning it up, greasing things, cleaning parts, cleaning connectors and all of that, I think we're going to have a really fantastic car on our hands.
For the first stage of our project on the 300E, we are going to be taking the idle air control valve off. Actually, I took it off camera before I got the show set up, but I explain it's very easy disassembly. It's a very easy thing to get to. You will have to remove the air box, but you don't actually have to open it up, so the air box itself is pretty easy to get off. You will need a metric socket set and a screwdriver set for this. I would say this takes an hour or less. It is a very easy job. There's nothing tricky about it. It's very easy to get to. You don't have to jack the car up or anything. It's all in the engine bay. So I would give this about a 2 out of 10. Just very basic job. While you're in there, it's a really good idea to go ahead and check your air filter, open up the box, clean all of that out, make sure everything's good and greased. As I show in the video, I like to grease everything as I go through a system. Greasing the components just helps them to have a longer life. And also it's a good idea to take a look at your throttle. The throttle on this is super easy to get to. It's just sitting right on the top of the engine there, right where the air box goes into it. And good idea to go ahead and clean all of that out while you're in there. But very easy job, as we will see in the video. Today we're working on the 1990 Mercedes 300E. It's got the straight 6, 3-liter straight 6, which is actually a pretty good engine, especially for its day. And these things can get a lot of miles on them. So the symptom that we are working through the system on is that it will start up. It sounds like it runs fine, but it's not going to get far. It'll
overheat, the engine will automatically cut off rather quickly. When we received it, it made it up the hill here and proceeded to conk out pretty much as soon as we got it parked. We've started it up a couple times since we received it, but this is the first time I'm really getting to work on it again. And did you find what this is called? We're trying to find what the name of this part is exactly. But the first stage of our working through it is that we cleaned this all out, which was super carboned in here. And this goes right here. You have to pop the air box off, which is very easy to do. You lift that off the top, which you got a connector there and there you got to be mindful of. This just has two hoses that clamp to it, and it has to do with an air valve. I know that much. I'm just not sure what exactly the name is. We'll find it and I can add it when we make the video. But anyway, you have the connector here. So whenever I work through a system, you always want to visually inspect your wiring. See right here we have a rub where the insulator has been exposed. That sort of a thing, especially when it's really tiny wires like that. It's kind of hard to get an electrical tape around it. This stuff is excellent. Liquid electrical tape, and you can brush a little bit out on there and then hit it with a little bit of electrical tape, and that will keep it good to go. And so you want to make sure, because even something like that, if there's arcing, it can really screw up your system. So we're going to get this cleaned up here. I got to get my wrenches. I put this on pretty tight. Get that cleaned up and install this back just to the two mounts. Very easy to get to, and that'll be our stage one. Here's the air box for the 300E opened up. You can see the air filter, which is one of these old style round air filters, and that goes down into the intake here, the throttle being right behind it right there. Pretty easy to get into. Once you pop it off, you've got both thumb screws and these screws here, 1, 2, 3, 4, that are mounted on there, and then the thumb latches are secondary to these screws. And you can see, like right there, I didn't have it all lined up, so it wasn't one to go. It should sit all the way down, very easily thread on there. So I've already just taken this out. The air filter is still pretty new in this one, so I just took it out and beat it and vacuumed it out some. But it's ready. I'm going to, of course, hit it with some grease, get this all oiled down real nice so there's no possibility of rust. Get these latched back on. But yeah, those four will hold it down, and otherwise pretty easy to disassemble. So we've got this back on here. This is the idle air control valve, and because it's just, you know, checking the air pressure coming through there. It's got the one sensor. I hit that with the liquid electrical tape so there won't be any jumping there. Just got the two 10mm bolts. We've got all four of our retainers back on here. I'm still going to oil this before I throw it back in there. And then the thing I wanted to show here is this is the retaining you see on the side there. That's supposed to slip down around this, and this did not have a nut on it. So it was just sitting on there without actually being attached, which is okay, but it's better to have it properly secured. So I sourced a nut from my bag of bolts, and so we will get this put back together and then see where we are at. Just wanted to show you the process I'm going through here and oiling this, hitting it with a nice layer of the wheel bearing grease. I'm a huge fan of the stuff, and it really is great for plastics and rubbers in particular. Gives it a great moisture barrier. Very, very important that these keep their moisture, especially something like this, which is sitting right on top of the engine. The high bearing, high temperature aspect of it means that it's fine in the engine bay and so forth. You know, you want to try to get it so that it mostly absorbs into your plastic, but it's really durable stuff, really excellent. You know, you just have to work it in, and you know, you can be pretty liberal with its usage. The very worst it'll do is just kind of smoke if there's a little too much, but if you really work it in, you won't have much on the surface. It'll just soak down into the thing itself, and it's great for plastics, great for metal, really good stuff. And you know, it's better to start with too much, and you can work it in, you can work it into the parts that are around it. Plastic parts, again, in particular, tend to crack, weather with age. This stuff is really great for preventing that kind of cracking. So really awesome tool. So here's the air box now reinstalled, just continuing to work that bearing grease down into the nooks and crannies of the filter, the box, the air box. And again, the point here, you need this is the nut that actually retains it, keeps it taut. Again, it wasn't on there, so it was functioning without it, but obviously it's better to have it. Now there's no play in this, it sits much stronger. You have this piece here, which needs to feed directly to the engine there. In fact, looks like we need to put an injector clip there, which is missing. And then you also have your vacuum line, which comes up through the bottom. And that's pretty much it for that aspect of this assembly. One more nut, looks like one more screw we're going to need to add right here. So I take it back, there's 1 and 2 points there. Again, this wasn't on there either, so I will have to source that in my bucket of bolts as well.
For the next step of our 300 restoration project, we are going to remove and clean the O2 sensor. For this operation, you're going to need a socket set. Now, you're not actually going to need any sockets themselves. You will need a wrench, a socket wrench. Now, the recommendation is to have an O2 sensor removal tool. They're not very expensive, should be less than $10, easily available online. I got mine on Amazon for about $7. This is give or take about an hour's job. It is a lot easier if you have a lift. It just makes it a lot quicker and easier to get to. I did it, as you see in the video, just out in our yard, so not too bad. You know, I'd give it a 4 out of 10 just because it is a little bit trickier to get to, because it's halfway up under the car. It's not in the engine bay as some cars have it, so it's much easier on a lift. You know, my recommendation is to find the sensor a day before you plan on removing it and spray it real good with some penetrating oil to make sure it easily comes out. And you will need to locate the sensor plug, which is in the passenger compartment under the carpet, and clean that as well.
Alright, so today we're going to be removing the O2 sensor on our 1990 Mercedes 300E. Pretty simple operation, but it does require you getting up under the car. Different cars have different configurations. For example, on our 88 BMW 528E, you can access the O2 sensor from the top. A lot easier actually than from the bottom, so you come at it through the engine bay. But here the O2 sensor on this car is going to be about halfway back, basically just under where your shifting assembly is, next to the transmission. So for this operation, you're going to need some sort of a solvent. I prefer PB Blaster. I particularly like their magnetic variety, and you're going to need a long static wrench to be preferred here, because you're going to be breaking it loose. This breaker bar is nice because it gives you how many pounds torque you're putting on it. And the one particular thing, now you can use a regular wrench, but I highly recommend against it because you're more likely to strip your O2 sensor using an open-end wrench. This is actually an O2 sensor removal tool. It is not expensive. You can pick one up at your local automotive parts store or on the internet for $10 or less. It's a very simple little tool, but the point of it is, see that it is a hex ratchet head, right? But the idea is that it has this side cut off of it so that you can slip it around the wire of the O2 and then seat it, because a normal socket you can't get around the wire. And so, for example, the the truck mechanic that I had so many problems with, they didn't have one of these, and every time they talked about removing an O2 sensor, if they couldn't get it off by the open crescent wrench, which typically doesn't work because it just doesn't, you don't get enough torque on the bolt, they were always talking about cutting the O2 sensor off. And I mean, you can do that, but this is not an expensive tool. You know, again, it is less than $10, and it is very near to universal. This is a 7/8 or 22 millimeter, and it's pretty universal. I mean, even this car, the O2 sensor on it is a little bit pricey for OEM Bosch, and you always want to put OEM sensors in German cars. They really have fits if you put aftermarket sensors in them. But the OEM, I believe, is about $80, $90 on this, but you can get the exact same sensor from Bosch with a different plug on it if you feel confident in being able to splice the wires, because Fords, some Fords, particularly the luxury models, had this. It's a self-heated O2 sensor, and so you can get the exact same sensor with a different wiring on it and splice it for about half the price or less. Again, that's just whether you feel confident enough in your ability to splice wiring. The first step, though, before you replace anything, is just to pull the O2 sensor and clean the heck out of it. O2 sensors are notorious for getting carboned up because they're part of the exhaust system. So every time your car, burns up a little bit of carbon and, farts out a little black cloud, that O2 sensor is going to get a little grimier and grimier. So it is imperative to clean these periodically. A lot of people replace them when all they really need was a good cleaning. And so just a point of safety here, there's a variety of ways that you can work under your car. I am working here with a series of raisings that I've done. You can see I've got blocks under the back there, just to be sure, blocks and boards there. And I've got it jacked under the front assembly there. And I've got this side off. You can see I got this wheel off, so I've got it on blocks, so it's very stable, very static here. This is a higher car, so you don't have as much of a crush damage as being under, say, a Porsche or something like that. I've spent my fair share of time under the 944 and 928, so I know what claustrophobic feels like. But okay, so we've got our lamp here, and you can see the O2 sensor is right there. Okay, there's our O2 sensor. You can see it is directly behind the transmission. That's the transmission we're looking at there. And relatively easy to get to. Not a terribly hard operation. The only issue, of course, is that you are crawling under the car, so you want to have it well supported. And obviously the best is to have it on a lift. It makes it a heck of a lot easier, but until I get a shop with a lift, this is what I'm working with. So you can do this in your garage or in your yard or whatever. It's not that hard to get to. I suggest hitting it with your wrench loosener. I use the PB Blaster, and I hit it pretty thoroughly yesterday. You want to let that stuff seep in. This one doesn't look too terrible, but it does have a little bit of rust around the exhaust where it mates there. And so, I'm going to take that off, and once you remove it, then it actually unplugs under the carpet in the passenger compartment. So once we've got it unplugged, I'm going to go on the inside and track where it plugs in and pull the wire through so I can get it out and clean it. So we've got the O2 sensor unplugged, or taken out of the exhaust. I'll be pulling it out in just a moment, but you can see here, this is where all of this is plugging into, and this does not look correct to me. Now, it's a bluish, at least in this one. This has a blue interior, but I would assume they wouldn't do that different. It's bluish going down to it, but my guess is somebody's already changed this, because you can see these wires here are spliced, and there's supposed to be a plug assembly here. So it's looking like
I will have to cut these wires if I want to fully remove it. This is kind of a messy situation in here, and it's moist too. A lot of kind of crappy wiring in here, so this will be something to clean up. But this is where it's going to detach. But this does not look stock. This does not look like what I've been seeing in the images and videos that I've been looking at. And it's not a bad splice job, but still. So we will, potentially I can clean it and just put it back on. I'm going to have to decide if I want to cut it out, but it doesn't look like it's unpluggable as it's currently configured. But that's looks like it's probably abnormal, at least in that it's not stock. It's something that somebody did to it. Now, I wasn't able to end up using this simply because the head having this back part, it just did not quite fit. I almost caught the angle, but just not quite. So, thanks to the efficacy of the PB Blaster, I was able to get it off here without a problem. And you can see the head of that is very, very crusty and definitely needs to be cleaned. I ended up just using a regular ratchet. That was the only way I was able to get the angle right, but the PB Blaster got it loose up enough that I was able to pop it off without much issue. Do be careful when you're taking it off, when you're turning it, that you don't mess up the wires. You kind of have to let them roll around and spool as you go on. But that's all there is to it, to taking it out and then cleaning it, of course. Should make a big difference. We'll see how it helps with this car. Alright, so a couple things we're going to do here. These wires here, these blue splices, not bad, but I can see a little bit of bare metal, so I'm going to hit them with some liquid electrical tape. And then this connector unplugged and actually had some moisture in the connector, so I've got some QED electrical connector cleaner, which I'm going to use to spray those out. So we're going to use some liquid electrical tape on those splices and some of this electric connector cleaner. And I'm going to use the same stuff on the O2 sensor with my wire brush here and get those fins opened up. The issue is that it's so carboned up that the fins are supposed to actually pull air into the element in the center of the O2 sensor, and it's so gunked up, no air's getting in there. So we're going to clean it up and see if that improves the idle. For this part of the project, we're going to be replacing the battery. I hesitated to even make a page for this, but just to lay it out, you will need a 13mm wrench or socket. It's a very, very easy job, should only take a few minutes. A couple points that I would note there: make sure you clean out the rain gutter under the battery, grease the battery compartment, the base plate, and so forth, and go ahead and clean your ground and check your ground strap.
Despite charging overnight, our battery did not charge, and our battery charger indicated that it was no good, which was something I was beginning to suspect. So I've taken the battery out. Typically, okay, so your positives over here, your negatives over here. Good opportunity to clean these grounds while you're in here. All these are 13mm, every one of them. And while you're in here, also very important to do is to clean out this trough here. Now you can take this whole panel off. You've got bolts there. Looks like I just got 2 on this one. But you got the bolts. I mean, you can take that whole pan out if you've got a really bad clog. I just fed my vacuum cleaner up into this hole and sucked it all out and blew some water through there. My assumption is that that's probably why there was a little bit of moisture in the passenger footwell. This is a good point for goo to collect. Batteries don't come out that often, so people will leave them in here for years and get, you know, gunkier and gunkier. So very important, if you're servicing a battery, go ahead and take that out and do that. And the other thing I did was hit all of this with grease. There was already a good bit of rust forming, so brushed it down, hit it with the grease, and you know, just slop it on there. Who cares how it looks? It doesn't matter. It's underneath the battery, but the more you slop on there, the better it'll take care of the rust and moisture issues, and make that metal last a lot longer. Got everything cleaned up and the new battery installed. The configuration of this battery was different. Rather than having the terminals negative here, positive here, I got this one because it was the right size and the right amount of cold cranking amps, but was cheaper. The only one that was listed at the store was a really big expensive one that was more than twice as expensive as this. This is a, you know, not a brand new car or anything, so we just needed a good working battery in it. So I had to deal with the difference there by changing out, and I was planning to do this anyway, changing out the ground there with a longer one that can easily run around. The positive's fine. The positive doesn't matter if it's there or there, but that way it's, you know, good amount of power. It's everything it should be. You know, it probably won't be as long-lived as the more expensive one, but will still work for us. And so now we shouldn't have any battery problems. Now we can see if it drains down, then we've got something else, that there's either a leak in the battery in terms of there's a leak in the system, something draining it, or the alternator's not working. But with a freshly put in battery, it should run for quite a while, and there doesn't seem to be any indication the alternator's not working, so we'll see how it does.
For our final stage of our process today of restoring the 300, we are going to flush the radiator and also remove the coolant reservoir. You know, depending on whether you're removing the reservoir or not, it will change the time and difficulty of the job. Just flushing the coolant is very, very easy and only requires a screwdriver set. You'll need a socket set if you're also removing the reservoir, which I do recommend cleaning that out while you're working on the system. Just a few points of recommendation: if you've got the time, again, take that reservoir off. Avoid using any harsh chemicals, any cleaning abrasives or anything like that, particularly in the reservoir, which is very hard to get water pushed through it. Grease everything as you go, and also just make sure, this is the dumbest thing I've run into so far in this car, it only had water in it. Make sure you're using the proper mixture of water and coolant. Don't just use water. Make sure you've got coolant in it.
So I've got the O2 sensor cleaned out and back on, but while I'm waiting for the battery to charge up here, apparently there's one of two things: either a bad battery or a draw in the battery, because I drove and parked this just a couple days ago and it was dead. It tried to turn over, but it didn't have quite enough. It turned the engine one time. So I got the charger on there. I know that it'll at least charge up to start. And while I'm looking in here, I noticed, just checking all my fluids, and that is gross. There's some scum in there. This is coolant. This is the coolant reservoir here. So while I'm just working through the systems on this, going to clean up this reservoir. The disconnect points here, you can see you've got a bolt right there, and I'm not sure. I'll have to look and see if there's a bolt behind that. I'll come back and update. But you've got a sensor connector here, which I'll take off and clean, and the radiator line right here, return line, which has a fitting right there. And I'm going to drain all of this because that's some really nasty stuff, and you've got looks like probably an overflow line perhaps coming off the top there. So definitely a good thing to do. That's really nasty, and coolant is not expensive, so we will pop that off and recondition it. So this has two retaining bolts that are predictably 10mm each, 1 and 2. The second one is the one that's hard to get your eyes on, but still not that hard to get to, just need an extension. So pretty straightforward there. And Then I was wondering, because you've got this hole here, and it got super filled with crap, so I cleaned all that out, wondering if there was maybe a bolt or something that went through there, but no. The third point that it harnesses is simply just a rubber foot on the bottom of the middle. So you have to be firm but, gentle with it and pull it directly up and just wiggle it ever so slightly side to side, and you'll hear it pop up out of there. And so at that point you can simply detach all of your hoses and remove your coolant reservoir. So it's kind of hard to see, but I just pulled the lower hose here. But you got to be very careful. I used some of my wheel bearing grease and got it nice and moist so it had plenty of move, and pulled that off, and it is just water coming out of here, and really scummy. Look at that. Nasty, nasty, nasty. That's in the coolant. Gross. There's like no coolant except that little bit of green in the sludge. So this is going to deserve a full radiator flush, and I'm going to pull the reservoir, clean it out real good, and get it good and greased up, and then put her back in.
Here's a quick shot of the reservoir, and you can see just how scummy it is at the bottom of that tank. Just totally gross. Stuff's just dripping sludge out of it. Absolutely awful. I can't believe somebody did that to this car. Just putting water in there is terrible.
So I've got this pretty well cleaned up. I didn't run any chemicals through it, simply because I don't want it'd be very hard to get into this. I mean, it's impossible. It's all contained. It's plastic welded around the edges, and you can see the lines running along here. See, those are individual compartments, and you can just barely see. Yep, I'm getting the shot right there. You can barely see how each compartment has walls, and then there's a little notch, a little door at the bottom of each wall, which allows the coolant to move through the system in just the way that the engineers designed it. Now, this was so gummed up you couldn't even see that little door down there because there was so much sludge sitting in the bottom. So that was just awful, and I did not see a bit of coolant come out of this system. It was entirely water, which is just ridiculous. It's just a few bucks. If you can put gas in the car, if you can afford to put gas in it, you can afford to put coolant in it. Come on, this stuff's not expensive. So I am going to flush the radiator completely, because, if you've ever seen a fish tank that hasn't been, and fish tanks are being filtered constantly, you see the kind of algae and muck, standing water, and this has got it's so much nasty crap in the line. I'm astonished. And you don't want just water running through your radiator. That's a terrible, terrible idea. You've got to have coolant. It's just ridiculously bad. So we will drain this sucker and get all that nasty old water out of it, flush it out, and get some proper coolant put in it. We're fixing to do our radiator flush here. I got a quick action shot when I undid the lower part of the radiator there, which is still off and dripping. And I just popped this one off. All of these connectors are all either 7mm if you're using a socket, or flat, or Phillips. Very accommodating. Look at all that mud. My estimation, considering that everything that came out of this was pure water, I saw almost no coolant in it, is that that's a little bit of rust coming through the radiator from just having water in it. So, normally I would just drain and refill a radiator, but this one being, having sat with water in it, I am going to flush it by putting my hose. I'm going to blast water through the engine, flush it out there, and in here to flush it out and make it run down through the radiator, get all of that gunk out, and then it'll just be a matter of hooking it all back up and filling it with proper ratio of water and coolant. So I've had a chance to blow out the line here and got a lot of nice muddy water out of there. Also, you can see how nicely the water beads up on everything that I've been greasing with my wheel bearing grease. So I pushed my hose nozzle. I've got one of those garden hoses with the skinny nozzle, but anything that you could get your hose in there, and pushed it in there and just let it blow out the system. And while the bottom was off, now if you're in a shop setting, of course you'll need a bucket or something to catch it. I'm outside, so it's just water, so I just let it go to the floor. If it actually had coolant in it, I would have collected it, but just the water is no issue. So I just kept flushing it. Initially the water came out brown and muddy looking. Just waited and waited and waited until it started coming out nice and crystal clear. So I'm going to button everything back up now, put our hoses back on, and fill it with the proper kind of coolant water mixture. Alright, so I just cut to make sure that it had plenty of coolant in it, and it started up just fine. Not getting any warning lights. So I think we are definitely improving this car. Having actual coolant in it is a huge improvement, and we got the O2 sensor nice and cleaned up. Still kind of running a little rough here, but we're working through it. It's getting better every time we fix something. So still not perfect, but I've just been sitting here for the last couple minutes just letting this idle and rev up, and see there, that's the chugging that it does when it kind of loses power. But it is vastly improving already. Really a good sounding engine. I mean, I really think that we'll be able to bring this guy back from the dead. It's going to be an awesome car. I thought I heard, when I was revving it, I thought I heard tinking, ding 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 ding, and sure enough, this, they call it coke. You get it in turbos also, where the oil cools. Carbon coke. It's all over back here. Little bits and pieces, craps and bits. Every time it farted out another chunk of this stuff, it ran better and better and better. I'm going to run some seafoam chemical tool through it and just rev it up and just keep, running it. And I think it's blowing all the gunk out of the system. And so this is running better, way better already. Got the new battery in it, and I have detected that what I think is the AC, I'm gonna have to check my diagram to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it's the AC, is not turning. And probably there's a fuse. I haven't gone through the fuses yet. I'm assuming that not turning is probably blowing out a fuse, which is probably why the blower system is off as well, because there's no no response at this point. I just haven't started in the electrical because we're still working on mechanical, but it does loosen up after a little bit and then start spinning. So I think that is part of the loss of power and the chugging. It seems to be proportionate to whether that's spinning right or not. Still going to keep revving it and try to blow that carbon out the butt. Once it gets lower on gas, I'm going to start feeding some chem tool into it and really try to clean out the fuel system.
For this week's viewer question, we're looking at what is the difference between a generator and an alternator in an automotive setting. So in understanding this, the original design of car electrical was called a generator, or also known as a dynamo. And so you have here an image of a cutaway. They're you know, just looking at them, you're not going to see much difference between a what's called a generator, again, or dynamo, and an alternator. They look very similar. The initial thing that you notice is that dynamos tend to be much bigger. Now, this is the older technology. You don't typically find this on any cars made past the 1960s. The original alternators came out in World War II. In wartime technology, they started hitting the consumer automotive market and became standard features starting in the 60s. But a dynamo produces direct current, DC, which is what a car uses. Now, an alternator, again, this technology was developed beginning in the 1940s, but came into the consumer market as standard options, Chrysler 1960, and then everyone caught up at that point in the American market. So an alternator, same basic principle, right? You have a physical generator, so this is the thing that produces amperage. It produces electricity, and it's a tiny little generator where you're spinning a coil of copper producing electricity. But the difference is that a dynamo or generator produces direct current. Now you say, well, a car runs off direct current. Why isn't that better? It can only produce low amperage, typically only about 10 amps, whereas an alternator, the reason that it's called alternator is because it produces AC, like what runs in your house. Now you say, but wait a second, doesn't in the battery, isn't everything in a car run on DC? It is, but an alternator can produce a much higher amount of amperage with much easier, so they tend to be much smaller, and then you have what's called a voltage regulator, which then converts that to DC and regulates the voltage output. So that is essentially the difference between them. Installation wise, if you ever happen to be working on a 1950s car or earlier and you are working on a vehicle with a dynamo or generator in it, you have to actually polarize a new one if you install it. Now with the alternator, the trick there is that when you put in a new alternator, be sure that you have topped the battery off, that you put a charger on it and top it off. Typically if a alternator is dead, the battery will also be drained down, and so make sure you top off the battery, because you don't want a new alternator out of the box to be pulling full load in charging the battery. It can kill it. You want that wear-in period to be low load. So that is the essential difference between them. Again, generators you're not going to find in any cars, any modern cars. They really have not been in cars for the last 50, 60 years, but classics, you can still find them. And it is possible some people convert from a dynamo to an alternator, though if you do that, that involves some significant wiring changes as well. You can't just throw an alternator into a generator or dynamo-based system. Dear Lord, we come to you now in prayer to take a moment to pause and consider and reflect. I know personally I have been going through a lot of doubt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty, and while I maintain deepest faith that my life is directed, that it does have significance and meaning, at the same time, sometimes it's hard to see that. So I pray that you give me eyes to see and you direct my feet so that I move towards your path. I ask that you do the same for my listeners, for them, for their friends and their family. I ask that the love, the power, the peace, the serenity of your gospel to descend upon us. We know that we are unworthy of your love. It is wholly and freely given to us, and we ask that you bring that light, that amazing beauty into all the dark spots of our lives, and show us, give us your peace. In Christ's precious name I pray. Amen.